Sam Zabor. I met him at Behavioral Safety Now Terry's conference a number of years ago. One of those drop the mic speaker moments while he had been transitioning from his career at Bayer Pharmaceuticals, where he spent over 20-something years pounding the safety professional paths that many folks here have been walking. During that time, if you think about the initiatives in your company around diversity and inclusion, you might have seen that coming on fairly strongly over the last, say, 10 or so years. Sam was instrumental at Bayer and continuing on in looking at how, inclusion and making sure we have diverse workforces and what that means to not only the happiness of folks at work, but also their ability to work safe. And I actually hope to bring one of my students back next year who's studying diversity and inclusion to get that going. Well, since then, as he's gone out and trying to impact the world as a consultant, he put together a leadership psychological safety check-in. And that's what he's here to talk to us about. I don't know if you know this or not, if you've been keeping up with recent news, but NASA, the American Space Administration, just picked a fight with an asteroid. So we're now at war with asteroids, and if we don't start treating each other better in the short period of time we have left, I don't know if you know this, but there are a lot more asteroids out there than there are people here on Earth. So we have a short period of time, and we got to hear what Sam has to say. A consummate storyteller, happiness guru. What was that last thing? Oh, well, it's in his bio. Happiness guru. He just wants to make you feel more comfortable in your own body and in the people around you. So help me introduce Sam Zabor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. I did go to the on. Hopefully there's not a mute. Are we getting any volume out there? I feel like I need a little bit more in here. Is it weak? Yeah. I mean, I don't have Sean's voice. I thought I had the loudest voice in the room. I don't. I might have the second loudest voice, but I'm not going to do the entire presentation at stage volume, though it's kind of interesting. All right. Let's give this a go. There, how's that? Oh, that's nice. Excellent, good. Put that back there. Let's start a timer for myself so that I attempt to stay reasonably on time. So, good morning, everybody. I have, eventually we'll get to what this Sophie part means. But first I'd like to talk just a little bit about my history with conferences similar to this. The Behavioral Safety Now conference, Terry's world-famous conference. The first time I attended in 2004 was the moment that sort of opened my eyes to what this was. And I had been spending a lot of that year trying to help my boss, Walter Fluharty, start up a behavioral safety program. We called it JESBO. Job Safety Behavioral Observation, and we had this little prop, a squeezy saxophone, get jazzed about JESBO, and Walter is definitely a leader in the behavioral safety field, and he brought a few of us to this conference, and all it took was the first half of the first day of the conference for me to become completely enamored with the concept of behavioral safety. There were 3 keynote speeches in a row that I heard. The first one was this guy, Jim Spigner. Some of you may know him. He brought up a concept that he is still pushing to this day about exposure, but he presented it in a way that just made so much sense if you focus on exposure to risk, right? Then you're really doing some work. And it's kind of interesting. I had spent 10 years as a researcher. This was my first year in safety. And so all of these concepts were new to me, right? So to hear somebody talk so explicitly and passionately about exposure started to turn a light on. Well, then the next speaker was this guy, Aubrey Daniels. And he had just been, actually it hadn't even been published yet. He had a book called The Measure of a Leader. And he described the measure of a leader can be described by the behavior of the followers, right? How well is the leader? Look at the people to whom, look at the people that report to that leader. Their behavior is a good description of how well you are as a leader. And he had a great saying. He said, when a manager walks into the room, everybody goes, oh shoot, there's the boss, let's get to work. But when a leader leaves the room, people go, come on, let's show the boss we can do it. And that is a concept that stuck with me, to hear that in your very first experience of behavioral safety. And then this guy followed up, Scott Geller. And so these are three of the people who you would, consider putting on the Mount Rushmore of behavioral safety. And he talked about active caring. And it's like, wait a minute, we've got exposure, sort of a very process-oriented way of looking at it. We've got the leadership perspective, and now we have that empathy, right? That active caring. And that's what Scott brought with his passion and his experience to that talk. So now I'm wondering if Abe is thinking, who are these guys up here? These aren't our presidents. Well, maybe I want to add a couple more, like this guy, Walter Fluharty, a person who had a great smile, but you almost never saw him smile, which was interesting. He was my boss. He exposed me to all of this, a world that some of you today are like, I'm thinking a little bit differently than I did before I came to this conference. That's what he did for me. And his boss, I was lucky enough to have Walter and Bob Edson. Bob Edson talked at the Behavioral Safety Now conference. He gave a great keynote about you can't push a string. And you think about that, trying to make people do things rather than pulling them along with that string. What about this guy? Oh, I saw Tim. He's like, wait, I got my phone here. No, that's me. Tim, where'd you get that haircut?
Born with it.
Born with that haircut. He's got that same haircut today. But I think we'll just stop here. And the man who brought us the importance of values and a values-based approach to safety, this, to me, will be the Mount Rushmore of behavioral safety from my perspective. And I think each of you could probably think of another person or two that you would sub out that have been important to you, whether it's someone on the job, right, or whether it's somebody here at a conference who just said something that was so impactful that you're going to take that with you the rest of your life. And that's what those folks did for me. So I wanted to thank them publicly for that. So this is an insanely brief overview of psychological safety, which is going to be the topic that I'll be talking about today. It was likely first mentioned in 1965, an atmosphere where one can take chances without fear and with sufficient protection. And it was sort of refined a little bit later in 1990. Being able to show and employ yourself without fear of negative consequences to self-image, status, or career. And it feels like that definition has stuck with us pretty well. That's sort of the benchmark industry definition. But there's also an organizational benefit to all of this that was pretty clearly laid out by a couple of folks, Amy Edmondson being one of them. When you feel psychologically safe, you're more engaged in your work, you speak up more often, and you're more motivated to improve the performance of your team and organization. So this quote here, I think, describes it perfectly. Amy said psychological safety is a climate at work, generally, but a climate where one believes that you can freely speak up with any idea, concern, question, even mistakes, especially mistakes. But I like to think of it as a sense of permission for something up here. What is it? A permission for, and if you know it, don't answer. But if you want to guess at it, I'd like to hear your answer. Permission for? The word is up there, or words, phrase. Permission for dangerous culture. What was that? Permission for candor. That describes it in just a nutshell. You want to take home what psychological safety is on the job? It's a permission for candor in any moment, at any time, under any situation, from the most relaxed lunch chat to the most stressful meeting, right? I think that's a darn good definition. So if we want to look at various stages of psychological safety, they've been fairly well defined here. This is from Clark from 2020. The first stage is inclusion safety. Now, as I talk about these, I'd like you to think about, well, what stage do I have at my job, or on my safety team, or with my boss, or with the folks who report to me? Inclusion is just a foundational stage, right? People feel like they belong, and I would say most folks would say that you have that, and probably have this too, where folks feel like they can participate. They can ask questions, right? Asking a question isn't as daring as some other things that you could be doing, right? But how many of you have this? And this is a pretty good stage. I would think that a lot of folks here would say, yeah, we definitely have 1 and 2, and probably 3. And when we're highly functioning, we definitely have 3, where people feel empowered to make contributions, right? And most of you work for companies that ask for a lot of performance, right? So they want you to feel empowered. But how many of you have this? This is what's known as challenger safety. Challenging the status quo. And this, again, like candor, sort of summed up psychological safety. Intellectual bravery, I think, sums this up. If you are at a workplace or even a situation at home, right, with your kids or with a significant other, where you can demonstrate intellectual bravery and ability to disagree, to dissent, to just say what's on your mind. Now, granted, it does depend on how well you can communicate that, right? Yelling some of these things is probably not helpful with a spouse or in a meeting, but being able to at least bring them up, that intellectual bravery is critically important, and that's the level to which we should all aspire as far as psychological safety in the workplace. So really, it's more like the 4 stages of candor, I think. So Amy produced some great stuff, like that big graphic I had with candor on it before. She put this out on Twitter as well, and I love this. And it's important to realize that psychological safety is not about kicking back and feeling good at work. So let's look at these different zones here. These are performance standards against psychological safety. So clearly, if you have a company that doesn't really care about performance, but you also don't feel safe, you're pretty much just showing up, looking out for number 1. That's the apathy zone, right? But how many of you have been in this situation, and I think most of us probably have at some point in our lives, where there was low psychological safety but high expectations, right? High anxiety at work, where you're reluctant, right? Because you don't want to put yourself at risk. There's not enough safety to be able to do that, but oh my God, the expectations at work are high. That's the anxiety zone. Maybe just as bad as the anxiety zone is the comfort zone, right? And there was a place, there was a waterbed sales company called the Comfort Zone where I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. So when I think of this, I grew up with a waterbed. So I have a deep personal connection to the comfort zone. And where you're collegial, right? But you're not challenged. You're having those great chats and everything, but how much is your mind engaged in coming up with brilliant ideas and really helping people? Oh, you're getting a paycheck and you're pretty happy at work. This can happen too. But she calls the learning zone a place where high performance standards and psychological safety meet. And this is the place where we kind of all want to be. We want to work for a company. We want to feel like we're doing things that are meaningful, right? But in an environment where we feel like we can take risks. So if we look at this whole thing, right, we can almost also put those 4 levels of psychological safety kind of against this graphic as well, right? And I think it plays pretty well, actually. And so Amy says, look, this is not being nice, and it is not lowering standards. It's just being able to have candor in a highly functioning work environment. kind of think of this, right? Apathy is our country's leading cause of whatever. I like this shirt. I would wear that shirt. So, I'm going to give you some more evidence about psychological safety, because Google has a lot of money, and Google does really good science. I would love to work for Google X, which is a company that basically requests failure. They want you to think so big that they expect the majority of their projects to fail. But if you get one or two that are successful, it will be transformational, globally transformational. And so they did, and that quote is attributed to Aristotle, which is why they called this Project Aristotle. So you looked at a bunch of their diverse teams, 180 teams. Some were high-performing, mid-performing, low-performing, and they asked for evaluations from the team leaders and for the executive sponsors and also members of the team. And they evaluated these answers also against sales performance, against the quarterly quota, right? And I think this is critical to have in here, right? Because it's not that we're doing this to see, we're really looking at metrics and data and how it benefits Google, right? So this is, in some ways, both selfless because they shared the data, and selfish because it will help them to build better teams. And this is what they found. In decreasing order of importance, what they found, the best teams were the ones, first of all, number 5, impact. Like they felt like their work would actually have some impact. But also meaning, and those are two different things, right? Because maybe your work doesn't have impact, but personally it feels good. It's something that, we're not quite having the global impact we wanted, but it is meaningful. So either the work itself or the output had meaning. Structure and clarity, oh boy, how many of us wouldn't like to see that as an improvement in some of the teams in which we work, right? An understanding of why you're doing what you're doing. And number 2 is dependability, right? Relying on your teammates to be able to do their part of the job, and they, in turn, relying on you. Just these 4 alone are pretty nice. But they found that psychological safety was number 1. And it was so important that they made this cool little graphic for it. And this is what they said about it. In particular, no one on the team will embarrass or punish someone for admitting a mistake, asking a question, or offering a new idea. Right? Doesn't this look just like all the evidence I just presented to you from the 1965 to the present, as confirmed by Google's research, a very extensive research project? So, knowing all of that, let's shift gears a little bit. So now you have a good background in what psychological safety is, and that it's been proven to be important. When might your brain say this? Talk to the hand. So if you read the description of this talk, part of it was that your brain shuts itself down without you knowing it, right? And when I say you, I mean me. Don't think anything up here that I talk about to an audience is just you. I'm learning today. I learned this morning. I'm learning tomorrow. I'm not expert at all of these things. I'm trying to improve, continuous improvement, right? So my brain shuts itself down and says talk to the hand when it should actually be inquiring and seeking more knowledge and more understanding and more collaboration and more insight, or having more empathy, or having more values. So we need to talk about a couple of concepts first. And Sean actually touched on some of those. Some of these things, I guess, were discussed in last year's conference. First, numeracy, just to know what it is, really. And if you look at these key words, it's a mathematical way to sort of interpret data and arrive at an answer. So numeracy is a skill, and it's a skill that can actually be measured. Versus heuristics, and this was also mentioned at various times. It's when you have a limited subset of data, right, and you need to make a more rapid decision, okay? So numeracy You're kind of looking at a lot of data, perhaps. You're taking time to analyze a question. Whereas heuristics, you're taking a guess. Somebody described it, and I thought this was really good. Somebody asked you how many jelly beans are in this jar, you know, and if you were using heuristics, you'd say, well, this looks like there's about 50 here and maybe 200 in the bottom, and then maybe 5 stacks of 200, and there's about 1,000 in the jar, right? Because you're using a limited amount of data. You're only seeing the outer shell of the jelly beans, and you're making a best guess. But numeracy would be, well, let me dump those jelly beans out and count every single one of them. That's the difference between numeracy and heuristics. Excuse me, heuristics would be, sorry, I went in the reverse order. So this also comes into play with something called System 1 and System 2 reasoning, which was just talked about very briefly earlier. I'm going to show all of these slides. System 1 reasoning is often the type of reasoning where we take a best guess. We have less information, we're a little bit more impulsive. And System 2 is where we're actually using sort of systems to come to an answer. Somebody give me an example of when you'd want to use System 1 reasoning or heuristics. What's something that almost all of us do where you need this? Driving. Yes. I mean, you know, you're not pulling out your infrared monitor and saying, okay, that car is 142 feet away, and they just put on their signal, and they're moving, it looks like at about 0.7 miles an hour to the left. I'll probably have to, you can't do that. Driving is just a series of heuristical decisions happening rapidly over and over and over again. You kind of go with what feels right? Right? You have a high capacity and little effort. You can do many, many of these in a short period of time, or even over a longer period of time, because they don't tax your brain so much. Give me an example of when you'd want to use System 2 reasoning. Budgeting, yes. Oh, you had, Sean?
Trying to figure out if you need overtime to increase it.
Exactly. Looking at everything Sean just talked about for the last hour requires, budgeting. You know, would you use this doing your taxes? I'm not saying you haven't in your lifetime, but you're probably using this, right, when you're budgeting, when you're doing a project plan, right? You're not taking, I think the building's about 80 feet, but, you know, right? So, I want to present a paper, a study, and I'm trying to sort of build a narrative about the importance of psychological safety, but that it even goes beyond what the common discussion is around psychological safety. And the common discussion is, if you are in a room and you have a brilliant idea, or any idea, and it is not psychologically safe for you to speak up, you won't speak up. But I think it goes even further than that. I think without psychological safety, your brain shuts itself down and you don't even come up with that idea in the first place. And so this study, and when I think of Dan Kahan, something comes to mind. Now you may have seen that little graphic up there. I always think of Dave Gahane, just because the name is so similar. Does anyone know who Dave Gahane is with? What band? Who? Depeche Mode, yes. And one of the greatest albums ever, Violator, which is now 32 years old. I can't believe that. But when I first heard about this, I sort of had this connection. Oh, Dan Kahan, Dave Gahane, you know. And there was no actual connection, but it sort of made me feel a little enlightened just to think about it in that way. So this paper talks about a study that was done. And it was over 1,000 people. Pretty much half male, half female. Average age was 48 years. 73% self-identified as white. 11% as African American. And 28% of the sample self-identified as Republican. 36% as Democrat. And 30% as independent. But they also broke that down into another category. Those who were very liberal or very conservative. And I'll give you a little teaser. It doesn't look good for either one of these. So it's just so you know, this really is a politically neutral, paper. So I'll just take a breath. Let's not worry about that part of it and just look at the data. I was warned last night about this. So, so all subjects were assessed for numeracy, using a series of word problems from this paper here that Weller et al. Did. The mean education level was some college. People made about what would be $60,000 today, and this study was about 10 years ago, right? In April and May of 2013. So this is their numeracy. So the scores ranged from 0 to 9. And if you're looking at the breakdown by Democrat or Republican, it roughly mirrored the overall sample. Kind of bell curvy, kind of what you'd expect. If you had 100,000 instead of 1,100, maybe it'd be even more bell curvy. This is the question that was asked, or this is the data that they were shown. Right? So just take a few seconds to look at this. These are patients who did use a skin cream, and the other one are patients who didn't use a skin cream, and they were asked this question. People who use the skin cream were, which result, right, does this data support? People who use the skin cream were more likely to get better than those who didn't, or people who use the skin cream were more likely to get worse than those who didn't. And there were a lot of mistakes made in this analysis. One of them was to rely too much on the left column by itself and say, well, 223 got better with the cream, 107 got better without the cream, and just automatically say, sure. But then a lot of you data scientists in here are not comfortable with that. But another common mistake was made too, and said, well, clearly with the cream, 223 got better, 75 didn't. But the thing is, you really have to look at the ratio, right? You have to look at the percentages. And people who use the skin cream got better at a rate of 3 to 1. But people who didn't use it got better at a rate of 5 to 1, or 25% versus 16%. So the answer is this, right? People who use the skin cream were more likely to get worse, because 25% of them got worse versus 16% who got worse when they didn't use it, right? Now, here's the thing. You see that little trick at the top? Worse changed to better, and better changed to worse. So they wanted to analyze the data in this direction. And of course, if you do, you get the opposite answer, right? People who use the skin cream were more likely to get better than those who didn't. Now, if you're wondering if this is a difficult question, it is. It's a very difficult question. It requires some numeracy, some patience. You really have to work it out. So 59% got these answers wrong. Only, I think about that. 59% of the total study got the answers wrong. And of people with where their numeracy score was in the middle or higher, only 48% of those folks got it right. Right? So this is actually a pretty tough question. And so let's remember, the name of this paper starts with motivated numeracy. So now let's look at this data as a scatter plot. It's pretty clear to see that as the numeracy got better, so 0 means they got it wrong, 1 means they got it right. So these are the number of people with an 8 or 9 numeracy that got it wrong, and quite a few more got it right. So you can clearly see from this graph that as your numeracy increases, your chances of getting this answering it correctly also increases. But what happens if we change it and make it something that's politically charged? We'll go back to that in just a second. Let's just look at a trend line of everybody who was asked this question about the rash, but in terms of whether or not they identified themselves as a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican. And you can clearly see everybody started to get it a little bit more right, the higher numeracy they had. It's exactly what they would have predicted. So what happened here? What happened here? What are you seeing? Does one's political inclination? Now you're saying, well, this is crime increases, crime decreases. I've given you an incomplete set of data to work with. What they did was, instead of asking if a rash increases, they told them these are the number of cities who used to have a allowed people to carry concealed weapons. And for a year, what they did is they took away their ability to have concealed weapons, and they just asked, did crime increase or did crime decrease? And you can see that's a difficult question to answer when it's just about a rash. Well, apparently it's even more difficult to answer when the question is politically charged. And so liberal Democrats were disabled and not able to come to the right answer. When the right answer was crime increases, they only got it right half the time versus their peers when they saw a question where it showed that gun control laws were working. Same thing with conservative Republicans. When it said that crime went up when you enacted gun control, they were able to arrive at that answer at a much higher rate than those who were looking at data that didn't support their existing beliefs about whether or not gun control would be good or bad for a city. So the best analysis is, I think, to look at it is this way. And we want to look at this here. This is the probability of correct interpretation. This is what's known as a Monte Carlo analysis. And you just it breaks it down into something easier to look at, which is like a bell curve. So folks with low numeracy only scored a 3 out of 9. When asked the question about the skin cream, they got it right about 30% of the time. And that's what we would expect, considering the average was a little bit higher. So we expect maybe folks with lower numeracy to get it here and higher numeracy maybe to answer it up there. But when the question, and here's high numeracy, sorry. So here's the folks with low numeracy, and those that were more skilled in numeracy got it right about 80% of the time. Okay? So clearly numeracy comes into play. Even when people who identified themselves with a particular political leaning were answering a non-political question. But what happens when they were answering the politically based question? What you see, those differences in those two curves, and believe me, it's bad for both sides. What you see here is a disabling of your ability to come to the right answer when the right answer does not flatter your political beliefs. And so what we see here is, you want to know what their thoughts on gun control were. I wanted to look this up to see if this was a confounding piece of data. Maybe people's thoughts on gun control turned out to be a little bit different back then. And what I found was it was roughly split, right? Conservatives were against gun control, and liberals were for gun control. So I wanted to make sure I got this Pew data here, and we'll roll that back up. What you found is, look, here's the average for folks with low numeracy. How did folks with low numeracy, when the correct answer was crime increases, get this question right 65% of the time, when the average could only get it right 30% of the time when it was a non-political question? You really had to put on your thinking caps to do that. But you also had to say, talk to the hand when this is about crime decreases. I don't want to hear it, right? And if you, so remember, the title of this paper is called Motivated Numeracy, right? These folks here and here were motivated to find an answer that more deeply connected with their expectations, with their belief systems. And when you look at high numeracy, it gets worse. People with high numeracy should have been able to figure this question out with greater skill than those with low numeracy. But look what happens. If we go back here, there was a 10% amount of motivation when the answer flattered the Democrats' political beliefs, and a 50% amount of motivation for conservative Republicans. We go back to here again and look at those numbers. That 10% shot to 45%. In other words, the correct answer was crime increases. Democrats didn't want to hear it. They said talk to the hand, and they got that answer right 45% less of the time. It was a bit higher for conservative Republicans. I bet if you repeated this study, you could see these numbers also reversed. The point is, this is a lot of, well, I wouldn't, hey, what's happening there? This is a lot of impairment, right? How impaired were people with high numeracy when opposing their own political predispositions? So Upton Sinclair has a really cool quote on this, as I move to the next part, I will just allow you to read it so we can see how this comes to play at work, right? So this was their study conclusion, and I'd like to just read it for you. When policy-relevant facts become identified as symbols of membership in and loyalty to affinity groups that figure in important ways in individuals' lives, they will be motivated to engage empirical evidence, that's like actual data, and other information in a manner that more reliably connects their beliefs to the positions that predominate in their particular groups than to the positions that are best supported by the evidence. If you are in a group and they all love electric cars and you just happen to be cruising around TED and all of a sudden you find out, oh wow, it takes a lot of energy to make those batteries. How motivated would you be to bring that back to your group who all have electric cars? Probably not so motivated, right? So gives you a good example. Imagine in the workplace where not only is it not, if you don't have psychological safety, which would counter this, your brain might just say, I'm not even going to bother. Talk to the hand. I'll just sit at the meeting. I don't even have to come up with anything good because you're not going to listen to me anyway. So if we look at this as a little bit of a fight, which it isn't, but how prophetic was this? In 1922, none of our beliefs are quite true. All have at least a penumbra of vagueness and error. The methods of increasing the degree of truth in our beliefs are well known. They consist in hearing all sides, trying to ascertain all the relevant facts, controlling our own bias by discussion with people who have the opposite bias, and cultivating a readiness to discard any hypothesis which has proved inadequate. First of all, how nice would that be at work? How nice would that be at home? How nice would that be in every community where we could have this, this utopian getting together and respecting everybody's opinion because it feels psychologically safe, right? And we clearly see this. I have my doubts just like anybody else. I don't know if I'm the wise one or the fanatic or the fool, really. Okay, so torrent of truth is a concept I'd like to present to you. Torrent is just a way of saying a sudden large amount. Like if you were looking at a geyser exploding, that would be a torrent of water, right? If you're listening to a George Carlin comedy show, it would be a torrent of expletives, right? and so my age is showing. Truth. This, I think, is a really nice quote. Truth is a nonpartisan reality that, whether we prefer it or not, exists to be discovered or eschewed, which means, ignored, pushed away, to a degree tantamount or equal to our cognitive self-awareness. I'm just kidding, I wrote that. It always comes more when you put some famous name up there first. You're like, oh, Goethe, I've heard of Goethe, that's a pretty brilliant statement. This is my belief, my personal belief, and truth exists. You might not want to believe whether truth exists. You might ignore it. There have been plenty of times I've gone to sleep worried about something, and I'm just like, I need to push this to the back of my mind and ignore this truth and just think about something like fantasy football, right? That happens. That's reality, right? Truth exists whether you believe it or not. The data from that study exists whether or not a conservative Republican or a liberal Democrat wanted to find it, wanted to use their best thinking to discover it. The truth exists regardless. Almost like when you walk out of the bathroom and you have toilet paper on your shoe. You may not see it, you may not know about it, but it exists anyway. And I only show this because it's convenient. This could have been a Democrat. Don't think anything more of it than that. But it's just odd, somebody walking into Air Force One, any human being, and not noticing the torrent of truth, the toilet paper stuck to the back of their shoe. And this is not fake news. We haven't confirmed whether or not it's toilet paper or just regular paper. So I want to give that disclaimer. Okay, I got to do some talking now, and the talking isn't going to be my own talking. I don't know what time it is. Okay, we're getting close. So I'm going to read this through. So what is the antidote for our minds saying, talk to the hand? And the antidote is self-awareness. And it's a type of self-awareness that I've tried to cultivate my entire life. I think I'm good at it, but I need to get much better at it. I was very bad at this for quite a long time. So I want to read you something from this podcast by Corey Allen. This is from his podcast called The Astral Hustle. He said, finding self-awareness is a game of chance in a strange way. If someone did not by chance interact with a book or some type of talk or receive some type of information that would turn that light switch on in their brain and open the door to it, then they're simply not able to see that part of the map. But if you can see it, if you are aware of it, that's quite a gift. Because it means that you've encountered some type of information that has allowed you to think greater than just what's in your own head, to see yourself from the outside, and to understand that you have areas that you'd like to improve. But also, more importantly, you have the ability and power to make those changes and to improve. Whenever you recognize that you're living mindlessly, you've succeeded at living mindfully. Like somebody says something to you, and in your mind you go, I know I shouldn't react in a highly emotionally charged way, but then you do. Okay, you may not have succeeded in your actions, but you've succeeded in being mindful because you did check yourself mentally, even if it's only for a few fleeting moments. And this is what you can cultivate to ensure that, hey, when I see something, should I be using heuristics or numeracy? Is there a torrent of truth out there that I'm missing? And that comes when you succeed, when you live more mindfully. But to do this, you have to notice what's happening as it's happening. You know, what you want to do is to create this space between whenever you notice something that's happening and the impulse that's arising before the bad habit comes out into the world. They call this the witness mind, right? And so the witness mind is a part of your awareness that's in the back of your mind that knows your thinking, right? It's not the identity self that's embroiled in the thinking and consumed and drawn into the story of the thinking and acting those thoughts out. But the point of awareness, deeper than that is aware of the thinking itself. When they say back of the mind, they're not talking from your actual part of your brain. Imagine there's everything in front of you, like I'm seeing this entire audience here, right? That's what's in front of me. Imagine if that's a baseball game, right? And it's a completely different amount of information. What if it's driving? What if it's a board meeting? What if it's a safety stand down? That's happening in front of me. It might be emotionally charged. There might be things that I'm thinking, that I'm seeing, a situation that I'm embroiled in, I'm wrapped up in, I'm involved in, and my brain wants to output stuff into that situation. This self-awareness is something back here that's aware that you're thinking these things and feeling those feelings and about to engage into an action. And you're witnessing yourself doing these things before they come out into the world. This is something that may only be this big, but if you practice mindfulness, which could be done through meditation, it could be done through journaling, or through one of my favorite things, talking to myself when I'm driving. I love doing this. I love sort of like running things through my head while I'm driving. I think it allows me to better examine what's going on in my head, right? So whatever practice you find would expand this, it would be worth your while, because as you cultivate that, you're able to take it into your daily life and you're able to watch what's happening as you're experiencing your experience. You become aware of what's arising in your mind and you're able to slow down enough to notice the impulse to act in a way that doesn't serve you or others well. And before these impulses manifest into the universe, or before the words leave your mouth that could be hurtful or harmful to another human being, you recognize they're rising. You recognize that those impulses to indulge a bad habit are coming, and that space that you've cultivated in your mind, right, gives you a choice to be able to let them go. And he calls this rewriting the script of your mental operating system. Because we do have control over our mental operating system to at least some degree. And the more we work on writing, rewriting, rethinking, reprogramming that script, the better we are at interacting with ourselves and with others. And the better we can see truths rather than ignore them. Right? So basically, it's about intentionality. You're splitting your awareness. You're splitting your mind. The self that sees everything and the self that sees you seeing everything. So I added this quote after a very brief conversation last night. I'll just leave it to you. Be aware of the thoughts you are thinking. So I have a very few minutes left. 5 minutes, apparently. So I am going to run through some things that I've implemented, some things that I've borrowed, and some things that, I think if I got a few emails from you, we could even improve upon. 5 ideas to help increase your psychological safety at work. Number 1 is to create some kind of formal recognition process for recognizing psychological safety and intellectual bravery. One of the things we did over at Merck is to introduce this. It's called Kudos Corner. And it's very cool. And it had an initial iteration, and in its second iteration, we added a few things about psychological safety. So here's the normal stuff you'd expect, and this is just a form on Microsoft Teams, on the team room, right? So it could be very easily done. Who are you sending kudos for? And look at these categories. Teamwork, physical safety, psychological safety, intellectual bravery. When it's physical safety, we did break it down to both at-risk behaviors and at-risk conditions, right? But we asked people to recognize others. And it's not like you get a prize every time this happens, but you do get an email from somebody saying, hey, I noticed you spoke up in that meeting. Thanks for showing that intellectual bravery, right? And of course, you can embed the safety part of it, the physical safety part of it, into the same type of format, right? Where you're just asking, hey, did you notice an at-risk condition or behavior that reduced the exposure in the workplace? Number 2, adopt a practice where every meeting starts with a check-in. This is a different kind of check-in than you're used to. And by the way, this is also applicable to starting a physical practice. What I mean is, say like you are about to start up a task that involves multiple people, and they all really need to be prepared for what they're doing. They need to be ready. They have to have work awareness, right? You could also have a physical check-in, just making sure, hey, everybody raise your hand, if they're in the same room, or you check on the walkie-talkie, is everything okay in that area? It's a check-in. A meeting check-in is the same type of thing, but the idea is that we all go into these meetings with a bunch of stuff in our minds that we would like to unload, but we can't. Our kid is sick, I got into a fender bender on the way, and that's in our mind. But if you start with asking questions about, hey, how are you feeling? And we heard this yesterday as well. Check in with people's feelings. How are you feeling? How are you doing? What's going on? And everybody has the option to either chime in or not say a thing. You can be silent, or you can say, you know what, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm like a 3 today, and here's why. And now suddenly the release of that, which was in your mind, sort of allows you to be more present in the meeting. So in some ways, this is kind of psychological safety and also a meeting effectiveness tool. Understand that different types of feedback require different approaches, right? And so I'm just going to talk about 2 of them. Now at the end, I'm going to show you my a QR code for my LinkedIn. If any of you would like to talk or you want me to share any part of the presentation or any of these tools, that's what I'm about. I know it said, Cognitive Soup Consulting and that I'm here with 4 other, Merck employees, but it doesn't do much good sitting here on a presentation. Some of this stuff could do a lot of good in your hands and even improved upon. So this is something that I put together about giving feedback, right? And 2 concepts I want to talk about briefly: permission, and this is particularly important with constructive feedback. always make sure that the person has given you permission to give feedback. Hey, is it all right if I talk to you about something right now? And if the person says no, they don't get the feedback in that moment. You and ask, so hey, okay, when might be a good time for us to have a little chat? Or, and if it has that there's an immediate safety, need, of course you have to give the feedback in the moment. But most feedback doesn't have to be given when the person isn't open to hearing it. And not only that, how effective is the feedback going to be if they're not open to hearing it? And just granting that permission automatically opens you up to some feedback. And on the second sheet, I talk about a few other things too. Privacy is super, super important. Not only unless it's positive feedback, it should never be given publicly, unless it's somebody maybe, being completely out of line or, personally insulting someone or getting violent or something like that. Yes, again, fix these things in the moment. But otherwise, find a private space. And if you're a supervisor, don't make the space your office. Make the space somebody else's office. Make it their office. Make it the lunchroom. Make it the break. Make it somewhere where they don't feel like intimidated to receive a piece of constructive feedback. So the location really matters too, and privacy. And then finally, you can introduce psychological safety as part of your performance reviews. I mean, for the people that you supervise. And then there's a tool that I have called the Psychological Safety Leadership Report Card. Apparently this is what I'm supposed to be talking about. And I've basically run out of time, but I'm just going to let you see it. And if you want the tool, please email me. It is 5 behaviors that start with the letter A. They all apply to psychological safety. There are 5 behaviors for people leaders, folks who have direct reports. Excuse me, not people leaders, because we are all people leaders. I never appreciated that term, people leaders, for folks who have direct reports. They are people with direct reports, and then you have the people who are reporting to other people, and they are also people leaders, just as much as anybody else. Awareness, asking, and advocating. So without going into too many details, you read these questions to yourself, and you ask, do I do this? And if you do, you give yourself an A. And if not, you give yourself a work in progress. All right, I'm going to work on that. Yeah, I may be aware and I may ask, but how much do I check in and actively advocate psychological safety within my team? I need to do that more. Or if you don't have direct reports, do I demonstrate it? I think that third behavior is the one where most people are like somewhere in the middle, and you could probably do better. It's the case for me too. The fourth behavior has to do with acknowledgement. This is the positive reinforcement, right? Positive reinforcement of behaviors that you'd like to see repeated in the future, right? And this is what someone with direct reports could do. And these are the behaviors that somebody without direct reports, they can still use whatever formal recognition tools you have at your company, or just thank someone, or buy a $5 Starbucks card and give it to them. What about giving positive feedback to your boss? It's uncomfortable sometimes, because it's supposed to be the other way around, supposedly. But sometimes you have to demonstrate for your boss the behaviors that you'd like to see them demonstrate, right? And so once you start doing this and your coworkers start doing this, even somebody who's not on board will kind of have to fall in and start demonstrating psychological safety. And finally, adapting to new conditions. It's simply, our workplace, you go from 600 people on site making cement to 1,500. That's a new condition. Or, at Merck, we have an entire building. Who knows when the next product's going to show up on site? That's a huge condition that we would have to adapt to. All of you have those have to adapt to new conditions. And psychological safety is particularly important because this is the kind of thing that often gets forgotten when we go through major changes. Checking in with people, seeing how they are, asking how they're feeling, ensuring that you're getting the best out of everybody because the environment is psychologically safe. So, I will leave you with this. Now, raise your hand if you know who this is. Okay. Yeah, and my wife, and this gentleman here. Her name is Ivy, and I'm just going to play something for you. And I want you to tell me what you think. Because this is really, who is Sophie? That's the whole title of my presentation. Who is Sophie? And why should every boss be like Sophie? So let's give this a play. Let's see if this works.
It's just a goat.
Hold on.
You gotta hit the function button to turn it on.
Okay, thank you.
Function, there you go.
Is that Phil Collins? I love Sasan. He did sell out a little bit, but he's pretty darn talented. And with this,
It's just a goat.
okay, I paused it here. Look at that sweet, adorable face. Who is Sophie? That's Ivy. Who is Sophie? What? Her mom. Her mom. Just like Mike yesterday made it psychologically safe for his son to call him at 11:30 at night because he was concerned that if he didn't make that a safe thing to do, that he wouldn't call at 10:50 and then wouldn't call at 10:20 and then wouldn't call at all. She made this a psychologically safe environment where she was surprised, used the expletive, and even though Ivy doesn't ever swear, parroted what the parents said. And that's why Mom goes, no, it's just a goat. And she goes, no, it's an effing goat. And she's looking out the window. That is psychological safety. Sophie has made this a psychologically safe house. And that's the kind of thing that I think we could all bring into the workplace a little bit more. So, well, I just happened to get the swear word in there. So with that, I will leave you. I want to thank you very much. If you have any questions, I know there's a break, so I'm going to stay here and let you all get to the bio break. Please contact me anytime through LinkedIn. I'll be happy to share anything and everything with you and have a discussion. Thank you very much. All right.